All right, Jason, welcome back to the Breakdown Network, but first time to Bitcoin Builders. How you doing, sir?
Great. Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, no, I am too. It's interesting. When I thought about Bitcoin Builders and what it meant to do a show about Bitcoin Builders, it wasn't sort of strictly developers and entrepreneurs. It was also people who are basically using their perspective from wherever they are in the world to help build out the Bitcoin ecosystem in the way that feels right to them to contribute. And I think this book that you've just written is a part of that. So I
Well,
guess let's start with your journey and what made you want to write this book. Let's start there.
sure. Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me on. I'm a huge fan of the work, and I know that you're branching out in all these different directions. So I'm happy to be part of it, for sure. I My book just got released last week, so it's a progressive's case for Bitcoin. The journey that brought me to writing the book was essentially, I developed this conviction for Bitcoin. Like a lot of people, that conviction quickly became like a strong, deep conviction, and I really cared about it. I wanted to teach people about Bitcoin and help them understand it a little bit better. My day job as a teacher, I'm a math teacher, so I've been sort of used to for the last couple of decades teaching people about complicated or challenging concepts. And Bitcoin seemed like a nice challenge for me to be able to convince people of its beauty and its value and its importance. And I just kept finding that the resources that existed out there didn't speak to the people that I was hanging out with, right? That we have colleagues, friends, family members who, every time I would sort of make a little bit of headway to explain, all right, here's the value of Bitcoin, not just pretend money, and here's why it's important. And we make a little bit of progress. And if they went and looked at some of the resources that existed online, they might be turned off by it. So, um, my decision to write the book was essentially an attempt to have a resource that I could hand somebody and say, here's where to start your journey. Here's where you can kind of learn and get a conviction about Bitcoin. And once you have that, and once you have the groundwork settled, or sort of the base knowledge accumulated, then you can branch out and dive deeper into the rabbit hole from there. So that's what I set out to do, and it really stemmed from not necessarily a political drive for myself to say I need to get this political message out there. It was really a teaching impetus to say I want to teach people and I want them to feel comfortable learning a complicated, intricate topic, and I needed a new resource to do that, or at least I wanted one. So that was what motivated me to write the book.
Let's do a little bit of definitions for the beginning of this. How do you define progressive?
Yeah. So I think that what, especially within the Bitcoin space, there's no one definition. There's a range, right? And I'm somewhere on the spectrum of a left leaning, liberal, progressive person in the United States. All that context makes is important. My target audience for this is somebody who identifies as a progressive person. They take a look at sort of, at least in the context of American politics, and they say, I'm generally voting for Democrats, maybe not exclusively. I care about a social safety net. I care about the government having some sort of positive impact on the lives of people and making sure that there's protections in place for vulnerable people who need it. So the target audience, essentially, the way I like to sort of frame it in my mind as I'm writing and as I'm talking to people, are essentially people who vote for Joe Biden because that's like they think that's the best choice, right? Not that they're super excited about Joe Biden, but like that's the best choice out of all of the options. And we can say what we want about somebody who votes for Joe Biden because that's the best option in their mind. But there's a lot of people like that. There's a real lot of people out there who sort of view themselves saying, hey, I think, institutional racism is an issue. I think that I don't like the way certain politicians talk about immigration or about, the social safety nets or the taxation for the rich or whatever the case is. There's a lot of people out there who kind of align with that, who know nothing about Bitcoin, who only get their information from, say, popular liberal senators or, media pundits that, who are incentivized to attack it. So really, the goal is to take that a person who fits that archetype and say, here's some resources to counteract that other information that you're getting. So for me, progressive means all of those things, but it's specific. My definition is specifically American because that's my background and my experience. It means different things for different people, and there's certainly a lot of Bitcoiners who are to the left of me, who feel more strongly about dismantling the state from a left perspective, and so there's a range. And that's one of the reasons why the book is entitled A Progressive's Case for Bitcoin. It's not the progressive case for Bitcoin. It's not like a singular thing that exists as a fact. It's just, I took a look at the space and said, this is how I view it. This is how I think it can help. This is the benefits that I see in it.
Do you think that, holding aside specific policy positions,
Sure.
one of the biggest sort of starting point differentials between someone who's coming to Bitcoin with a progressive perspective versus a conservative or libertarian perspective has to do with assumptions or beliefs about the role of government in people's lives? I mean, is that a sort of it feels to me that it's one of the more fundamental potential differences.
Yep. Yeah, and I think what's surprising to a lot of people that I talk to in the Bitcoin space is the conservative libertarian, which are different, but they're usually aligned within the Bitcoin space, is the government does bad things. We want to dismantle the government. Bitcoin is a tool to dismantle the government, take away its ability to tax and to do all these things, and we're going to separate money from state, and that the goal in doing that is to dismantle the state apparatus because it only does bad things. And then that's a gross, over a simplification of it. But I think that what I find interesting is when I'm having conversations about this is, there's people on the left who don't like things that the government does, right? They say, they look at certain policies and they say, yeah, I don't like my government doing that, right? Starting a war on foreign soil that never ends, or, treating certain people in a bad way. They look and say, hey, I don't want my government doing that stuff either. So there is some common ground among people on the left and the right to say, hey, the government is doing these bad things. Now, it's just, I don't think that people on the left are naturally starting out their Bitcoin journey saying the government doesn't do anything good and we need to dismantle it, right? That's not the starting point. So, and I think that it's totally useful and important to engage in a dialogue about the importance of Bitcoin to the people who aren't starting out there, and who might not want to get there, and who can find valuable and interesting and important things about Bitcoin without sort of this use case of like, well, now the government can't exist because we've reached hyper Bitcoinization and we've achieved all our goals. There's other versions of the future out there. And I think it's important for our community, for the Bitcoin community, to be talking about what those other versions might look like. And yeah, so I think that starting point is different. And I think that my hope is to give people a resource that is, when they're starting in a different spot than some other people in the Bitcoin space that already exist, a different resource for them.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. So let's talk about, let's hone in then on the progressive perspective coming into Bitcoin.
Well,
what are critiques that you see progressives having, or that make sense for progressives to have with the existing monetary system, right? So holding aside Bitcoin as a solution, what are things that you think just, sort of, average progressive might say, hey, I have some questions about that as relates to our existing monetary system or economy, more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's no shortage of critiques of the economic system and the economic engine as it currently exists, right, within the progressive left of center population. There's sort of this sense that the government is supporting these very large banks. It doesn't really make sense that we're doing that, or why are we doing that? There's really no understanding of sort of a deep understanding of monetary policy and financial institutions. It's very opaque and hard to learn about. And I think that there's, a massive, wealth inequality and increasingly so throughout our system. And I think that people on the left are very quick to say, all right, well, there's wealth inequality or there's income inequality, and this is like, it's becoming grotesque and it's not sustainable and it's going to cause all these bad things. And they already have in their mind, like, okay, here are the causes of that. Here are the reasons why that exists. And I think, that's obviously a problem. If you're on the left side of the political spectrum, you feel, all right, wealth inequality is something um, to be thought about, something that maybe needs a solution, something that we should be worried about. Um, Not many people are thinking about like the underlying financial system and how money is created and how who gets to control that money, who gets first access to that money. All of those things are sort of like underreported or hard to learn about or different from the usual reasons that are given by people on the political left. And so, Bitcoin itself provides a different lens to view those problems. And I think that's, a theme throughout the book to say, look at all the things that you don't like about the current system. And there are many. Look at Bitcoin. Bitcoin provides you a lens to look at those problems and then also look at possible solutions that you haven't thought about yet.
That makes sense. It's almost like it's just sort of a way to look at potentially underlying reasons for a thing that aren't necessarily considered that produce an outcome that people wouldn't like. So let's take it one that you deal with, in some detail is inflation. What do you think that the normal kind of progressive or mainstream progressive discussion of inflation is versus the way that a progressive Bitcoiner might see it?
Yeah. I mean, most of the people I talk about, so putting aside elected officials and like policymakers, right, and sort of their sound bites, you talk to regular people, they definitely just view inflation as sort of this natural thing that exists and nobody has any control of it, right? So it's sort of like the tides, and sometimes it's high and sometimes it's low, and nobody really understands, what's going on with inflation on the ground, right? So first of all, there's really just an ignorance about sort of how monetary policy ties into this idea of inflation. If people have a strong sense of what inflation is, it's really just sort of the CPI that's issued by the government and reported out as price changes. And so I think that, there's, and in addition to all of that, there's sort of the political jockeying that people are being exposed to say, all right, well, it's not the monetary policy, it's the corporations that are being greedy and raising prices. And, all of these sort of like misdirections from our political leaders to say, oh, no, inflation, I know that you're feeling this pain of inflation, but look over here. Oh, no, look over here. So people blaming all sorts of different things. And there's really just a lack of understanding among the voting population, right? That, the CPI is one faulty way to measure inflation that's been changing, for the past, several decades, last almost century. It doesn't necessarily reflect your personal basket of goods and services, and it's been changed many times and altered many times. So it's just really sort of a creaky old way of measure something that's complex and dynamic. And at no point in any sort of mainstream sense does anybody talk about, the increase in money supply or monetary debasement when it, relates to inflation. It's just sort of price changes, and these price changes happen by magic, or there's sort of forces of nature that we can't really contend with, and there's no way to understand them. So we just have to sort of like look at what it was last month and report a number out. So I think there's this real unfortunate dynamic where people don't know a lot about it, and the politicians are very good at sort of pointing in various different directions to say this is what inflation is, and you should be focusing your attention on these companies or these corporations or these billionaires who are trying to manipulate you, as opposed to saying, all right, well, inflation is in very large part, a monetary policy issue about how much money is in the system and how the current money that you have is being debased or not. So I think there's just a lack of understanding that hopefully, as we continue to sort of push the education about the current financial system, people will start to see that in a more clear way.
Do you think that one of the negative parts of just American partisanship in general is the extent to which political narratives pushed by politicians sort of almost push people to not ask underlying questions, right? So you gave the example when it comes to inflation of it's greedy corporations, right? And that being sort of all you need to know about inflation, and that being the entire explanation. Certainly you could go cherry pick any issue you wanted and probably find a right explanation and a left explanation that is sort of not nuanced and not the full truth. How much is the issue as you sort of start to introduce Bitcoin to people who aren't natively interested in sort of it in the same way that that other groups are, to get past just the sort of over reliance on existing political narratives in general?
It's huge, and I think that Bitcoin as a specific tool has an opportunity to possibly bridge a gap that exists, right? To say, hey, not every single issue has to be a political thing where you need to know where the left falls and where the right falls before you can form an opinion. And I think you're right, like that partisanship, that hyper partisanship, where people are just sort of knee-jerk reaction to here's the issue, here's my thought, is not conducive to talking about deep underlying systems. How do we make progress? How do we make change about things? Where is the nuance? There is absolutely, we treat politics. If you just, if you, I was at the restaurant the other day, and on the wall was a screen with politics and a screen with sports, and they're just, you couldn't tell the difference except, like how they're treating it with the sound off. It's just like, all right, left versus right. And it's, same thing with sports, right? So it's just, there's no nuance there in the discussion, which is a problem. And I found that there's a lot of passages in my book that aren't necessarily political at all. And if somebody is reading that and saying, all right, well, this is a progressive person who's telling me this fact about Bitcoin or this fact about the current financial system, then they're already going to have a built-in assumption about it, right? And if you just sort of packaged it differently and took the same exact words and said, hey, this is a conservative person who's telling you this thing, it would be just as factually true and somebody would agree with it. So it's really unfortunate. What I have found is that, by having these conversations with people, they are starting to question a little bit about sort of, this is the echo chamber I'm in. I was told that inflation is caused by this. And you say, well, you just need to dig a little bit deeper. You need to keep learning about it. And it does, there's an opportunity for people to broaden their understanding of issues to a more systemic, intricate understanding of what's causing these things without flip-flopping or feeling like you're abandoning your like core political principles. Like there's ways to broaden your horizons a little bit and how you analyze and think about the issues. So I found that in conversations, I found people sort of really grappling with the fact that, well, if I believe that, am I still really a progressive, or like what's going on? So I think that's all great. Like that's a really good question. Those are good questions to be asking yourself, and it's great dialogue to have. Since I've been in the Bitcoin space, I found that like I haven't necessarily removed myself from the echo chamber that existed before, right? This liberal politics, it exists on the right too, right? Like you just hear people that agree with you all the time. I just found that now I've added myself to another echo chamber also. So I've not gotten rid of the echo chambers. I've just sort of, now I have two of them. And it's interesting to see, hey, there's places where these two things overlap, and people in either echo chamber would never believe you if you told them, hey, this is how Bitcoiners think about this stuff, or this is how progressive people think about this stuff too. They would never believe that there could possibly be overlap, but there certainly is in spots, not complete overlap, but in moment.
So let's talk about that overlap a little bit. How
That,
much, when you think about sort of the natural conclusions that a progressive Bitcoiner would come to, how
yeah.
much do you think that the path is towards actually wanting a Bitcoin standard and the end of fiat money and a hard money standard in general, versus having Bitcoin as a release valve for society? And then I guess alongside to that, how do you see traditional progressive programs, entitlement programs work in a Bitcoin system?
Yeah, I think that in the book, I treat this, I try to leave room to sort of argue, all right, what happens when we move to a Bitcoin standard completely? What happens if we remain dollarized, but maybe we have, a Bitcoin backing to the dollar, and it means something different than it does now? These are both viable things that might happen in the future. And sort of what our systems look like under that, what our systems might change to if we change our monetary system. And I think that I don't necessarily advocate for one over the other, except that Bitcoin should be playing a major role, like in the future with our financial and monetary systems. But I don't think, I think for most people in the target audience reading the book, they're just going to be surprised to learn that like this is a real thing and it actually has uses, and we need to learn more about it. And I think that when you fast forward to a situation where our government is dealing with sort of an international standard where people expect to be operating with a hard money, that's most likely Bitcoin, then it just changes the role of government. And I think that there's a voice. Many people would say, all right, well, it means that the government can't exist. I don't believe that. I think that it changes the role of the government in the following ways. Um, if you can't print money, then you need to operate, in a more transparent and deliberate way as a government. So if there's goods and services that we want the government providing, then the people who we elect to be our leaders need to be transparent about that and say, we're going to tax you. This is what the taxes are for. This is what we want to use the taxes for, and this is what we're going to do. And if you don't like what we're using our taxes for, then you elect somebody else to come in and take over, and they can tax you differently, and they can provide different goods and services. And it just provides, it takes away this cloak of inflating the money supply and printing money, sort of that opacity where decisions are getting made, money's being spent. There's no direct tie to any sort of elected government official to say, all right, I've elected you to lead us and make decisions, and this is what we want our money spent on. We're not making those hard decisions right now. We're just giving, the military budget and all of the social programs are just sort of through the roof, and nobody's really being held accountable. So I envision a world in which the government needs to be more responsive and more transparent and more efficient, and more accountable to the voters, because there's just not free money floating around that the government can print. So does that mean that like, oh, the government can't, like progressive values don't match with Bitcoin because that means you can't provide any social programs because the government, can't print money? I don't think that's true. I think that we need to pick and choose. And if that means that, it also means that we can't go off and fight endless wars all over the world. It also means that we can't give subsidies to oil companies. There's lots of ways the government spends money right now with its printed, made up fake money. And all of those things need to be looked at again if we change to a Bitcoin standard or have some sort of version of Bitcoin backing the dollar. So it's not just the progressive policies or infrastructure or systems that need to be relooked at. It's everything. And I think that if the government is more accountable and responsive to the people, then the popular things, the things that we really care about as a society, continue forward, and they're used or they're implemented more efficiently. And the things that we don't want as a society go by the wayside, and we say, all right, we can't afford to do that anymore. We can't afford to go fight an endless war in some other place. Can't afford to give subsidies to oil companies anymore. We're going to do it differently. And so there's room in there for progressive policies, but we need people in power and advocating for those just like anybody else. So it's really, what do the people want from their government when this happens, and the government being forced to be in a position where they have to provide it in a more transparent, accountable, and efficient way.
Given that the magnitude of that change from where we are now,
Yeah.
do you think it's surprising that Bitcoin has any advocates in government? I guess is to say, or and maybe we can broaden that question out to, you had a section, I think, or a chapter called "The So Far Bipartisan Approach." I'm interested in what your take on that is, and specifically if you think that that's in the midst of changing right now from when you wrote it.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of people. You can find Bitcoin supporters in politics right now on both sides of the aisle. As we know, it's a little bit harder to find people on the left. And there's certainly no shortage of people on the right who support Bitcoin just as a purely like politically convenient thing, right? They know it's going to be popular among their voters, or it's going to get them some attention. So it's hard to parse that out. Certainly there's been people on the left who've supported Bitcoin. Once they get elected, it doesn't turn out so well. So there's like, I'm wary of politicians from start to finish. I don't think so. I don't think that the people who are in power now are advocating Bitcoin from some sort of like, oh, well, like this is going to be easy because as a senator, I'm going to have to make hard decisions when Bitcoin standard comes around. So I don't know. I think that the the so far bipartisan approach to Bitcoin is really sort of an aspiration, and I'm hoping. So when I write that in the book, it's an acknowledgement that Cynthia Lummis and Kristen Gillibrand wrote a bipartisan bill together. At least they wrote it together from both sides of the aisle. And I think that there's hope that we haven't missed the boat. There's hope that we can talk some sense into some people on the left to saying this is important enough to learn about. It's important enough to support. And at least if you're going to make laws or regulations, you should better understand what you're doing and talking about. So, the answer is, yeah, I think we might be in the middle of it changing, and I'm hoping that we can kind of get out in front of that. That's the hope, because I do think that I worry that if we end up letting Bitcoin just become this political football, and we lose that chance to bring people together before they get separated, then as we know with any other political issue, it's going to be really hard to get people back in. So that's why I tried to write the book really quickly, because I think that we're literally in the middle of it happening. And I don't want it to happen where we're seeing that change. The hope is that it doesn't happen.
Do you think that I guess maybe what has to happen during the next election season, right? We're effectively in election season now, right? We're 18 months or whatever out. People are announcing. Is there, can people who care about sort of progressive Bitcoiners being in positions of power, is this the time to step up, or what is it aside from just sort of voting for people who seem to share those values?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, as you say, we're in the middle or maybe at the beginning of the next election cycle. I think talking about these issues is super important. Asking people running for office about their stance on Bitcoin and how they view it, its place in the world, and within our policies is super important. I'm not saying, I would never advocate, all right, well, you need to be a single issue voter, and if somebody supports Bitcoin, you have to vote for them. We just need to open the dialogue up and continue to sort of push our people looking to gain political office. Ask the question. I think that, for the last 14 years, it's been kind of a joke or something that can be ignored. Say, okay, well, what are your thoughts about Bitcoin? 5 years ago, you can kind of laugh that off, and you can't anymore. So I think we just need to keep up the education and the questioning. And ultimately, I wrote my book not as a primer for politicians, but as a primer for voters. So who knows how long it takes to see a shift? Like we're talking about are really big changes in the way that society runs. That doesn't happen overnight. So the idea is that one by one, the voters start to appreciate Bitcoin or the power that it has to change the world, and they start voting people. They start putting pressure on elected officials. They start voting for people who support Bitcoin, and that might take beyond this election cycle, right? I'm not optimistic that we're like the next president of the United States is going to announce a Bitcoin standard. I don't think that happens anytime soon. But I do think that the sort of the ground up from the voter up, slow and steady approach is probably doable and important. So I think that's the way I would hope to think about it.
Do you have concerns about sort of the direction of progressivism in general as relates to Bitcoin? It's increasingly popular, for example, to kind of pin all problems on wealth inequality and suggest that the answer is just confiscation of wealth. And Bitcoin kind of stands in opposition to confiscation of wealth. So, what do you think, or how do you see the sort of the larger questions of progressivism in general interacting with the Bitcoin conversation?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think a lot of a lot of the concern about, all right, well, I see this wealth inequality. I don't like the wealth inequality. I'm going to redistribute wealth so that we don't have it anymore, is centered like it's I hate to say well intentioned. Like I mean, I think the people who are doing that are acting in good faith and they think that they understand what this situation is. But I think providing a new lens on sort of like what is actually happening with wealth inequality in a more full picture helps people adjust their stance, right? So they have a political stance about, well, we're going to raise taxes in this way or we're going to lower taxes here. Um, you might see a shift with the way progressive liberal people think about this kind of stuff if they start to broaden their scope about what the problem is. So I don't know what that looks like necessarily, like in the end final form. I don't necessarily have any concerns. I think that there are plenty of politicians out there who are incentivized to behave in certain ways, and I don't really want to speak for them. I think that all of that can kind of change with the political system as we continue to educate about Bitcoin. So like specific policies and saying, all right, well, we're going to confiscate wealth, that you can sort of have a fundamental progressive outlook on life and say, here's how we want to treat people fairly. Here's how we want to give people a fair and equal opportunity to succeed without having such strong, wealth confiscation policies. And maybe that happens if more progressive politicians start learning about Bitcoin. So I do think that there's a way to sort of move the needle with continued education that is more in line with what Bitcoin represents than what we have now.
On the topic of continued education, you've published this book. You are heading out on sabbatical. How are you thinking about, the upcoming year in terms of taking this and making it sort of, even beyond what a book can do if it finds its way into the right hands? How do you get it into the right hands, and then how do you kind of translate that even further?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I have the book is out, and I have this great opportunity. Like I said, my day job as a teacher, I have the full next academic year off to promote the book, which means I'm free to travel around, talk to people, educate them as much as I possibly can for a full year. So my goal is to essentially just get the book out there into as many hands as possible, provide lots of opportunities for people to meet me, ask me questions, provide educational opportunities, give talks, explain Bitcoin basics to people, and all sorts of audiences, wherever they'll have me. So colleges, universities, conferences, bookstores, libraries, all sorts of things like that are in the works for the full year ahead of me. I do think that it's important for me, I'll just say this, is that a lot of people in the Bitcoin space know about the book because it's a Bitcoin book, and I'm saying nice things about Bitcoin, so they say nice things about the book. But the target audience is completely like, if you're already into Bitcoin, then you're not in the target audience, right? So the goal is to get the book into hands and in front of people who are just absolutely pre-coiners. They don't understand Bitcoin. They think that they can ignore it. They don't understand that it's important. Get the books into those hands. So like ideally, I would hopefully at some point in the near future gain access to having like a progressive audience that isn't specifically Bitcoin, specifically about Bitcoin, and just introduce this topic as, hey, I know that there's this thing out there that you've heard about multiple times and you've dismissed it, but you shouldn't. So that's my hope. And I don't, if anybody out there has an opportunity to help me, I would absolutely be grateful for it, just to get into any sort of audience of pre-coiners that need to learn about Bitcoin and haven't yet. That's the ultimate goal, is to just get in front of people that don't know about Bitcoin and provide them a resource that doesn't turn them off from the concepts completely from the very beginning.
I'm sure you're going to have to do this a lot if you haven't already, for progressives, if you had, a sentence, two sentences to try to convince them to take another look at Bitcoin, what would you say? And then sort of likewise, maybe for conservatives or libertarians or just people who are coming from a not progressive background, what would be your simple explanation for why they should care about having progressives aligned with them when it comes to Bitcoin?
Yeah. I think that the line or two that, if you could only do it one line or two for progressives, is to learn as much as you can about our financial system, and to understand that many of the problems that you see within our society and within our current financial system can be looked at through a different lens, and just to continue your education. So I think that's the number one sentence to say: just continue learning. Right, the problems you see can be looked at through a different lens, and this is the lens that I'm suggesting. Um, as for like, why should libertarians and conservatives who are already into Bitcoin care? I think that a lot of people have reached out to me um, to essentially say, I don't agree with you politically at all, but I think what you're doing is really important, and I think that's a nice message, because if we want Bitcoin to succeed, and you can argue, oh well, it's inevitable and it's definitely going to succeed no matter what. But if we want it to succeed on some sort of time frame that helps people, like the people that are alive right now that we really care about, it's important to build a heterogeneous, strong, anti-fragile community. I think that it's easier to attack Bitcoin. It's easier to marginalize it. It's easier to get, regulate it in a way that's unhealthy if it's only one kind of person, one population who supports it. I think it's much easier to do that. If you have a heterogeneous support across the political spectrum, people supporting Bitcoin or using it for a variety of reasons, for a variety of purposes, it becomes a lot more difficult to attack. So I think that if you want to see Bitcoin thrive in a way that I hope to see, which is it's money for everybody and it's a new global money that people can use to make the world a better place, then you want to see as many different kinds of people in the space as possible, and having healthy debates of ideas, right? You say, all right, this is what I think should happen. This is what you think should happen. If there's only one voice and there's only one group of people, it's just easier to squash. And maybe you don't even believe it can be squashed, but in the short term it can. And I think that I'd rather not see that world. I'd rather see a world in which it has broad support, and that if politicians try to mess with Bitcoin, there's a wide spectrum of people, across the political spectrum that are going to fight back, not just one kind of person fighting back.
No, I think it's good. I mean, I think we've certainly seen this year the speed with which politics can shift against an unfavored industry. And although it hasn't been sort of, the most acrimonious for Bitcoin specifically as compared to some other crypto assets, it is certainly a warning shot, I think, for people who care about Bitcoin and just the access to it. And I don't think it's incompatible to have a belief in the inevitability of Bitcoin and also kind of not want it to be as difficult as some folks would try to make it to use and interact with.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's my pitch, right? Like if you're a liberal person who doesn't know about Bitcoin, then you should buy the book. And if you're a conservative person who cares about Bitcoin, you should probably buy 2 copies, because you need to give them out to people. So, I think that's the bottom line, right? If we don't need to fight the fight, then that's better. Even if we feel like we can win, it's always better not to have to fight it. So I think that's the hope.
Well, I'm excited to see what you do on this journey. Here to help in any way we can, and let's go recruit some new progressive Bitcoiners.
Yeah, let's hope. I appreciate it. I'm really hoping that works out. Thank you.